The Living Zen-podcast is a gift from the members and associates of the Victoria Zen Centre to you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to let your friends know about Living Zen. If you'd like to support our community, here are a few ways that you can do it. Download the Living Zen podcast app for iPod, iPhone, or Android. You can also purchase additional Zen Talks by Venerable Eshu on iTunes or Amazon.com. One of the most meaningful ways to show your support is by joining our Sangha as an associate. Your commitment of $10 a month will ensure that offerings like the Living Zen podcast and our online e-Zendo will continue to be available around the world to everyone with an interest in truly living Zen. To become an associate, please visit our website at www.zenwest.ca and click on the membership tab. Thank you for your support. When the Buddha began to teach, he very clearly approached the issue of suffering. He dissected it, really investigated the way that we as human beings experience suffering, because he wanted to teach or offer a way of approaching life in which we could suffer less. In fact, we could be free from suffering. Suffering isn't actually the word. Dukkha is the Sanskrit word that we have, that we translate as suffering. Dukkha means much closer to sort of dissatisfaction. And I think that many of us, when we come to engage in this practice of meditation, when we come to check out what's going on Tuesdays at UVic, we come from this position of somehow dissatisfaction. Things aren't all they could be, we feel, or we aren't all that we could be. We've got too much going on. We're too busy in our heads. We're too emotional, or we're not emotional enough. But something, somehow, isn't right. So we look for a way of finding peace, or we look for a way of finding fulfillment, or we look for a way of finding satisfaction. I wanted to actually talk about the method or the practice that we use in Zen Buddhism to address this. Because I think that in our culture we have this tendency to approach problems very conceptually, very intellectually. And I think that there's a lot of really great courses, even at this university here, about Buddhism, that we can investigate and study and learn about the many teachings of the Buddha. And I don't think it takes very long. I think that we can very quickly actually read the teachings of the Buddha, and we start to say, oh, this stuff really makes sense. This stuff is really interesting, or this stuff really applies to my experience of life. One fundamental teaching that we come across is just this habit that we have of taking things, whether it's a physical object or a physical place or a relationship, or even and especially ourselves, this thing that we call a self, taking these things as objects. But when we investigate them, when we investigate environments, when we investigate objects, and when we investigate this thing that we call I, this thing that we call a self, we find that there is no object. We find that these things are not things at all, but they're activities. They are very dynamic interactions of innumerable variables that come together for the tiniest moment in the experience that we have at any time. Even this thing that we call this moment is not solid. It's not an object. It is an activity. There isn't anything that remains from thought moment to thought moment in our experience. Now, this is all very interesting. And we can consider this for a moment. We can contemplate things. We can break things down, even if we like, if we're scientists, into sort of like atomic levels. And we can see that actually this is true. There's nothing solid. These are all just activities unfolding. We can look at ourselves and think about what our thoughts are, and are they solid? Is there anything solid about them? No. How about our feelings? Not so much. Or our beliefs? Or even our physical bodies. We know every 7 years, every single cell in our body has changed from what it was before. We can find no solid place for us to put down our hands. No solid place for us to rest. This is a very fundamental teaching in Buddhism, and it's a very rapidly available experience for us in our lives. Part of the reason that we do this practice of seated meditation is to develop an awareness, the simple ability to be present as our lives unfold, this dynamic activity unfolds. But this understanding of our lives, of things, of experiences, of places, being activities, is not enough. Because what we find when we apply our awareness to our lives is that in spite of this knowledge, in spite of us knowing that things are not solid, that we are not a fixed self, that relationships and people and time and anything that we experience in our lives is not an object but an activity. When we apply awareness to our lives, we find that over and over and over and over again, we behave, we interact, we make relationship as if it were. And according to the teachings of Buddhism, this mistake, this sometimes it's called delusion, but I've always liked the description of a fundamental confusion. This fundamental confusion, particularly when the evidence is so abundant that we continue to go forward and make this mistake over and over again, taking our relationships as objects, taking our physical environments as objects, taking our situations, financial or otherwise, as lasting, permanent things. This is the basis of all of our suffering. Because over and over and over again, when we plunk ourselves down in this situation, when we sit ourselves comfortably in our relationship, as soon as we begin to assume that we have found something solid, finally a place to rest, it's like the dinner bell for suffering. Things change. And we find ourselves stuck. We find ourselves latching on, hanging on to the situation that we've come to believe as being fixed. Hanging on to the situation that we've come to think of as good or finished or where we ought to be or how things ought to be or anything like this. And yet the activity continues to unfold and we suffer. Or we can project that object, we can project that situation or that relationship or that self even off into a future, and then ignoring the activity that's taking place in our very lives, we're continuously striving for that object, striving for that place, striving for that selfhood, that object, where we will be finished, where we will come to rest. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk about this is that some people, when they come to practice Zen, make the same mistake with the spiritual practice. So they say, I'm going to go and meditate, and this will be the place. This will be the experience. This will be the situation. They hear about these wonderful mistranslations of Buddhist teachings, like enlightenment, and it becomes the master object. It becomes the great possession that we can seek after, and we can envision ourselves getting this thing that we call enlightenment, or reaching this place, this final location where we can rest, where the activity stops. But what we find is that this isn't anything different. We haven't found anything new. This is just the new job, or the new partner, or the new fancy car. But now it's less tangible. Now it's a little bit more difficult to see the futility of objectifying what is fundamentally activity. So, people come and sit, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to immerse ourselves, to allow the rigidity, to allow this thing that we call self, this object that we've mistakenly posited ourselves as, to let it dissolve, to allow ourselves to melt into the unfolding activity of the cosmos as this very moment, to realize in this life that there is only this activity. But we must understand that Zen practice, the form that we use here, is not like a warm and cuddly blanket. It's a very, in some ways, a very unforgiving mirror. The structure that we use in Zen practice, the corners, the keeping in step, the sitting straight, the chanting, all of the aspects of form, they're not accidental. These are tools that have been shaped over thousands of years that will catch us. Our practice as we sit, as we engage in Zen, is simply to completely immerse ourselves in the activity that is unfolding before us. And yet what we find is, as we're engaging in this, as we're melting away into the activity, now sitting, now walking, now bowing, now chanting, our insistence on expressing a self, our absolute habitual, unconscious persistence in insisting on a self pops up over and over and over again. It's like we're a very cold flowing river, and at every opportunity it solidifies, it calcifies. And we find ourselves, when we're chanting, suddenly worried about what it is that we're chanting, suddenly worried about how we look, suddenly worried about what so-and-so would think. When we're sitting, we find ourselves troubling ourselves with what's on our to-do list, what we should be doing instead of sitting. What a waste of time. When we're walking, worrying about what this means to be keeping in step. Over and over again, the self, this fictitious object, keeps popping up, and we latch onto it. And the experience, the result, the feedback of what happens when we fixate, when we start to become obsessed with the object, is immediate. We fall out of step. We lose the chant. We suddenly become distracted in our meditation. It can be actually said that our Zen practice is a fairly brutal mirror, one that's entirely clear and allows us to experience over and over again the habit, the persistent habits that we fixate, that we solidify, and how this habit leads us to suffer. Because while in our formal practice we can see that this fixation leads us to fall out of step, leads us to fall out of harmony in the chanting, leads us to become distracted as we're engaged in this absolutely simple activity of sitting and breathing. More and more as we go forward in our lives, we begin to see that this habit has exactly the same effect in every moment of our lives. When we're spending time with the people that we care about, worrying about this object self takes us away from experiencing the dynamic activity that is unfolding in relationship. When we're at work, our obsession with this self, with the situation, looking for the final resting place, leads us out of the dynamic activity that's unfolding as our lives. The reason that we practice this way is that just thinking about it will never lead us out. Just thinking about it does not disrupt the habit, does not disrupt the behavior, does not disrupt the persistent insistence on object life. But as we practice, over and over again, observing, over and over again, experiencing what it is, how it is to experience that fixation, we begin to also experiment with, we begin to also learn new ways of being. When we become aware of our solidifying, immediately our response is to soften, to let go, and to dissolve back into the unfolding activity of our lives. At first, we find practice demanding. We can find this practice brutal, rough, hard on us. We can take offense to all kinds of different aspects of form. But it's important that you understand that these offenses or these butting up against us is not accidental. And from the perspective of Zen, it's the best medicine. It is the very doorway to liberation. Our practice is not to run away. It's not to reaffirm the self by saying, I like this or I don't like that. I want this or I don't want that. But to say, oh, interesting. That has a corner there. What's that corner about? Allowing ourselves to soften into our breath and into our practice, we dissolve back into the endless unfolding activity of our lives. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.